Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I will be exploring the life of Queen Anne, who ruled from 1702 to 1714, with Andrea Zuvich. Andrea Zuvich, better known as the 17th century lady on social media, is a British-American independent anthropologist and historian specialising in the House of Stuart, 1603 to 1714, the author of several books on Stuart history, including Ravenous, A Life of Barbara Villiers, Charles II's most infamous mistress, Sex and Sexuality in Stuart Britain, and The Stuarts in 100 Facts. She is also a historical advisor for television, film, and radio. Zuvich has been interviewed on BBC Radio and appeared in historical documentaries including Charles I, Downfall of a King. She was one of the original developers of the Garden History Tours at Kensington Palace and is one of the founders of the Stuart History Festival. She also narrates audiobooks and lives in Derbyshire, England, with her family and golden retriever, Bertrand. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome to the podcast, Andrea. How are you?
Oh, fine, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you so much for coming on and agreeing to come on as well. So today we're
Thank you.
discussing Queen Anne. Not Anne Boleyn, we're discussing Queen Anne of Great Britain, if there's any confusion for listeners. Before we go on to Anne, I thought we'd discuss a little bit about yourself, and I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history?
Oh, I have loved history all my life. I'm a history fan through and through. Um, I think things really got going when I was about 6 or 7, because I was taken quite early on to museums and art galleries, and these are wonderful places where you can be exposed to so much amazing stuff. And I lived for the first decade of my life in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, in the US. And it was that city is so important for the history of the colonial period and the American Revolution. Um, and yeah, there was just so much of that, and it's the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I was able to see all these amazing artworks, and it just inspired this desire to learn more about the people of the past.
What is it about the 17th century or the Stuarts in particular that fascinates you so much?
Well, I have a tendency towards looking at the overlooked, and the Stuart period between 1603 and 1714 certainly fitted this description. People tend to focus on the glamorous Tudors and all the dramatic events of that period, and that's great. But at the same time, they tend to completely ignore the Stuarts. And yet, the Stuart period was this incredible period which saw the blossoming of what we now call science. Then it was natural philosophy. The arts during this time was exceptionally accomplished. We have sculptures from the likes of John Lorenzo Bernini. We have paintings from Van Dyck, Lely, Kneller, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and it could go on and on. But there is this plethora of exquisite portraiture from throughout the period. A drama flourished. We have, of course, Shakespeare, who died in 1616, so he very much counts. We have Ben Jonson, Dekker, and more. Um, and and so there's also the poems, the poetry throughout the period. We have John Donne, Andrew Marvell, John Dryden. Again, the list goes on and on. It is a period so rich with art.
And it's certainly not not it is filled with drama as well in the the 17th century. So
It's absolutely. I mean, I don't I can't believe it, but my husband told me that he was able to avoid learning history during his schooling. And he's learned about the English Civil Wars, the British Civil Wars through what I do. And I think that's terrible. I'm sorry. Um, and he's from Northampton, and there's a lot of Civil War history there. Of course, you have Naseby and everything. And I think the first time he visited Naseby was when he took me. Because when at my request, I said, "Can we go to Naseby? I want to see what that's about." So yeah, definitely. It's so full of everything. I mean, you have the Civil Wars, you have an interregnum where there was no royal family. There was no nothing like that. It was a republic, and then you had the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. Oh my goodness, it's so tumultuous, it's passionate, it's incredibly dramatic.
no, it certainly is. I mean, the Civil War affected. I mean, Chester was one of the siege of Chester lasted for about 9 months, I think, and where I live,
Wow.
and it's incredible because we were never taught it at school. In my primary, it's like how because it was such a big thing about Charles the First and the parliamentarians.
Yeah. Wow. Incredible. Yeah.
How did you begin a career in history?
Pursued history as a degree, um, and much to the opposition of some people in my family. They were saying, "You will never get any work as a historian." And I said, "I really want to be a historian. That's what I want to do." Um, and so I I did work as a secretary during my time. I was at a nursing home actually, and I was working the weekend reception work and everything, and so I was paying my way through university. Um, and I did several degrees, one in anthropology and one history, and with this aim of wanting to do something with it professionally. But then I fell in love and I moved over here to the UK. And so yeah, you roll with things that you don't really expect. And I came over here and I began volunteering quite a lot, everywhere I could. Funnily, because of my great love of Shakespeare, I was really into Shakespeare throughout my teens, and I still am. I I applied at Shakespeare's Globe and I was really excited about it. And then somehow I believe that my paperwork went missing and I was really dejected. I was really upset about that. And then I I decided I'm going to try to submit it to historic royal palaces. And I applied and I was accepted. Yay! And I was based at Kensington Palace. And what began as simply helping out at the entrance, it just evolved into so much more. I just wanted to help uh, doing something with history, but I ended up getting real hands-on training with curators and historians, and I was able to do stuff with help out with the Royal Ceremonial Dress Collection, the exhibitions, and that led on to other opportunities like starting the garden history tours, which I loved because it incorporates history and gardens and fantastic. And I was so fortunate to be able to work alongside a great group of people and we developed these garden history tours. During all this and my regular interactions with members of the public who came to visit, it quickly became clear that most people, even if they were interested in history, they were not well acquainted with the 17th century. So I would be standing in a room, and we had at this point the bed, Mary of Modena bed. Okay. And when I would say that, someone would say, "Oh, is that Mary, Queen of Scots?" So there is this idea of very few people will know who Queen Anne is, for example. They'll think immediately of Anne Boleyn, which is fine, but there is Queen Anne as well. And Mary of Modena, she was uh, definitely not Mary, Queen of Scots. So that got into my I started thinking about all of this, and I thought I'm going to begin my history blog, The 17th Century Lady, with the aim of trying to get this period noticed. And nearly 16 years later, I think it's definitely happening. My website has well over 1 million hits or something. I haven't checked. And it's quite popular, which is incredible to me. And more books are written about the period now, and even Hollywood is starting to take notice about this period.
No, I mean, I can't claim to know a lot about this period. It's not one I know a lot about, but The Favourite definitely brought that era into the forefront a little bit. Even if it's not that historically accurate, it brought it alive, and I think James the First is getting a lot of recognition at the moment, and I think
Yeah,
that brings it up so much more because it is such an interesting period.
it really is. And I'm so glad that it's not in the dark now and people are noticing it.
I mean, you also do Stuart Saturday Live as well. You did one today about William Shakespeare
Yes, that's right.
because
Yeah.
I tuned in because I watched it before.
Oh, thank you so much.
But if any listeners want to watch that, you do it monthly, don't you?
Yes, it's not usually at the same time every month. It depends on the availability of my guests. And I do tell people in advance. I promote it and with the date and who the guest will be. There's usually a guest. Today was a solo show. Um,
On to the main lady herself. When was Anne born and who were her parents?
right. Well, Anne was born in 1665, 3 years after her elder sister Mary. Um, Their parents were James, Duke of York, and his wife Anne, and she was originally Anne Hyde. Um, and from Little Anne, I'm going to call her Little Anne to differentiate between uh, from her mum. Um, she was often eclipsed by her older sister. Her sister was outgoing and vivacious, and Anne was the opposite.
When I was doing my research for this, it said that Anne was sent to France when she was a young child for her health. Why was this?
Well, Anne suffered from very poor eyesight, and at that time, the physicians in Paris were considered to be at the forefront of the most advanced eye treatment that could be found. And so she was sent there, and the other thing is she had family in Paris. It's sometimes not it's not really brought up very often, but the Stuarts and the Bourbons were cousins. Anne's grandmother, Henrietta Maria, who was the consort to Charles I, was a French princess, and so she was the aunt of King Louis XIV of France. So she was the sister of King Louis XIII.
What sort of education did Anne receive? Was she classed as a royal princess?
Yes, this is a point in which the Stuarts lack. I mean, you're usually doing tutors, and in comparison, I'm afraid the formal education that the Stuarts received, the ladies even, was almost negligible, really. And which is a shame because these girls were quite bright, especially Mary, perhaps it could be said. And so she didn't really have much formal education. She grew up with a household of girls of a similar social status.
Was Anne close with her family, in particular her stepmother after her own mother's death?
Yes, her mother, Anne, died when she was very young. Um, and James, Anne's father, married Mary of Modena, who was only a few years older than Anne and her sister Mary. Um, Honestly, they didn't have a great relationship. Mary of Modena was Catholic. She had a much better education. So she was on a completely different plane, so to speak, and so there was this, I'd say, a bit of a resentment of her. I mean, and to be honest, a child who has lost her mother, to have to be around this woman who's a girl, really, who's just a little bit older, it would have been very difficult for her. And so she had this sort of resentment and, indeed, I would even say a growing hatred of her, which would just continue over the following years.
No, I mean, it's quite understandable, to be fair. Is it going to replace how you feel about your own mother? It's one of those,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I mean, we see that now with people who who have mixed families, and it can be very difficult for the children involved. Yeah.
On to Anne's marriage. Why was George, Prince of Denmark, chosen as a bridegroom?
Well, the funny thing is, I think we should mention who was nearly going to be Anne's husband. There was a lot of talk that Prince George Ludwig would be her husband, and this man eventually became King George the First. So there is that. And and he this fizzled out into nothing following the potential couple's first meeting. They didn't get on well. Um, and he ended up marrying another cousin who was Sophia Dorothea of Celle, and she had a terrible life. So, uh, despite Anne's own future troubles, I think she did well not to be married to this guy. And before that, Lord Mulgrave pursued a teenaged Anne. He sent her love letters, and she apparently received these letters with some enthusiasm. But the other members of her family were not really keen on this. It wasn't advantageous enough. There wasn't enough of a political or dynastic, wealth there. So when she was 18, she eventually married Prince George of Denmark on the 28th of July, 1683. And this was after some months of negotiations and only 5 days of getting to know each other, I think. So at least they had some time to get to know each other, I suppose, when it comes to these politically made matches. Um, and George, they said of him, he was of the Danish countenance, blonde, and of few words. He did prove to be a very good husband for Anne. I think their personalities were very good together. It worked. They certainly had a good bond. They were uh, loving and faithful to one another, which is amazing, you know.
No, I mean, it certainly is in the early periods of history. It's good if a political marriage can be at least happy for them. And lucky escape for Anne as well. George the First wasn't the best
Yes.
husband.
No. Um, yeah, that was a terrible relationship. I think it led to adultery on both sides, divorce, the murder of Sophia Dorothea's lover, who was the Count of Königsmarck, I think. And it was just awful. I mean, there's this film called this, I think it was Saraband for Dead Lovers, and also I think there's a really good book about it by Catherine Curzon, and I really recommend that because that story is just absolutely tragic. Oh,
During Anne's marriage, she had multiple pregnancies, which sadly were either stillbirth or weren't to term, or they didn't live very long. Is there something that was possibly wrong with Anne and her health that caused this?
we don't really know. Um, we know that she and her husband George had a very loving relationship, and it was a happy marriage despite the hellish situation with their children. Anne had between 16 and 18 pregnancies, and whether due to miscarriage, stillbirth, or death from the numerous illnesses that were widespread during this period, including smallpox, they died before they could reach adulthood. And I believe there is reason to suspect that from circa 1695, Anne may have suffered from a condition called pseudocyesis. I think that's how you pronounce it, which is also known as a phantom pregnancy. Um, so she may have had more than these. According to Frederick Holmes, who wrote an amazing book called Sickly Stewards, which I recommend, he puts forth the view that Anne's sister Mary may have also had this. I mean, we have to remember that these women were under enormous stress to produce heirs.
No, I mean, no, absolutely. I think it's one of those, it's hard, especially when we're in the future, we're in 2025 and we're trying to guess someone's physical health. I think it's a bit of a difficult one.
Yeah, yeah. Unless she was seen by a modern doctor, I think that would be really fascinating to see if there was something that we could diagnose now that would account for possibly being one of the reasons why she had so much trouble.
When Anne's uncle, Charles II, died without an heir, Anne's father, James, became king. What was Why was it not a happy extension that he was not king? He became King of England, sorry.
James, Duke of York, became King James II of England and the Seventh of Scotland. He had his good points, of course, but he did not possess the affable manner for which his brother Charles was so well known. Furthermore, and indeed most importantly, James had converted to Roman Catholicism, which made him very unpopular amongst his Protestant subjects. Mary and Anne's mother, Anne, the former Duchess of York, she had also converted to Roman Catholicism shortly before her death. Uh, and this was very difficult for people to accept because there was this possibility that James would become a sort of autocrat, something that they didn't want, and he would create a Catholic succession.
Did tensions rise between Anne and her father due to his religion and the choices he was making as king?
Well, Anne and her sister were both raised as Protestants, so already there is this sort of tension already existing there because they have such different views on religion. Um, but she didn't really make her displeasure or anything known until much later. I think for the time being, she was pretty quiet about everything.
Could you tell us about the pregnancy of Mary of Modena and Anne's suspicions and doubts about this pregnancy?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, Anne never really got on with Mary of Modena. Um, and up to that eventful summer of 1688, when James Francis Edward Stuart was born, Mary of Modena had lost the children she had conceived. Um, and so people had become rather complacent. They thought, well, she's obviously not going to produce an heir, so let's not worry about it. The next person in line to the throne will be Mary. She'll be Mary the Second, and that'll be it. And they'll continue because at this point, people still thought that Mary, Princess Mary, would have a child with her husband William. And she was over in the Dutch Republic at that time, having married her cousin, first cousin, William the Third of Orange in 1677. So there was this complacency that people, these influential people at court, I should say, and in the government, thought that Mary of Modena was not going to produce an heir, and so Anne later said that she wasn't able to touch the belly, Mary of Modena's pregnant belly, uh, and so she made a bit of a big deal about that. And so that combined with these rumors that the child wasn't Mary of Modena's, it sort of snowballed into something much bigger. And her Anne's letters to her sister at the time were, well, full of rumor and speculation and not being sure that that was really their brother. So Um, and it's absolutely absurd, this idea that there was a warming pan baby and that this wasn't really the legitimate heir and everything. It was very convenient for them, very convenient. Um, and Anne certainly made much of that, I should say.
What was Anne's involvement in William and Mary's planned invasion in 1688?
Well, Anne, we have to think about the context of what she did around this time. She was heavily under the influence of her best friend, Sarah Jennings, who was married to John Churchill. Um, Now, Churchill was a very important figure at this time as well. He was a major military leader, and he became a turncoat. So he pretty much abandoned James and went to William's side. And in this chaos, Anne decided to go off as well. And there's this story about how she was in such haste to leave her apartments that she went into a carriage and she lost a shoe. So that was just showing how impulsive this whole thing was.
Did Anne show any kind of remorse for her father's situation? As this was still kind of a shock, wasn't it, that a king was in exile?
Yes, it was a very strange situation, but I think I'd say Anne was quite a stubborn character, and this is a sort of trait very common in the Stuart family. Um, I would say her sister was genuinely mentally and emotionally more torn by the whole situation.
Was Anne happy that her sister and brother-in-law were now the king and queen?
I would say yes for the most part. I think she was happier that a Protestant, or in William's case, a Calvinist, was in power. However, Anne did not like William, and William did not like Anne. And there are some stories about this, how Anne would display signs of gluttony at the table, which really irritated the more ascetic William. Um, and there's this tale, it might be apocryphal, but I think it really encapsulates their differing personalities. Um, there was a meal in which some fresh green peas were brought in a bowl, and they were placed on the table, and um, Anne was making her pleasure known. She was saying, "Oh, this is great. I'm gonna," and William, having seen her eat uh, heartily, he took the bowl and he emptied it all onto his own plate, so she couldn't have any. And so this is sort of then they weren't very nice to each other, and Anne called him the Dutch abortion, Caliban. So, I mean, it was a mutual dislike. So she might have been a bit happier that her sister was in power, but she certainly had no time for William.
Because of the dislike between her and William, did this cause tension between her and Mary? Because obviously that's her husband.
Yes, well, it certainly wouldn't make dinner times very comfortable, would it? Um, yeah. The main problem between the sisters stemmed from Anne's complete submission under the Marlboroughs, in particular Sarah. Of course, Sarah was an extremely formidable woman, and Anne was by her nature quite submissive, and she for many years looked up to Sarah with a kind of awe. And Mary quite rightly was concerned that her little sister was under the thumb of this very, very dominant woman.
In January 1692, Marlborough, who is Sarah Jennings' husband, was suspected of conspiring with Anne's father and followers now known as Jacobites.
Mhm.
How did this affect Anne?
Well, everyone knew how closely connected Anne was with the Marlboroughs, and William III already distrusted um, the Marlboroughs because John Churchill had already been a turncoat. And so if you already show that you can be a turncoat, what's to stop you from doing that again the other way around? And so he didn't trust them very much. And of course, this put Anne in a more awkward position. She was already on poor terms with William, but the fact that her great favorites, her closest confidants and friends, were doing these things behind the king's back and everything. That seemed really bad.
When Mary died in 1694, was Anne publicly upset about her sister's death?
Well, everyone knew that Mary was quite ill for a few days there. Anne sent a note saying that if Her Majesty would allow her the happiness of waiting on her, she would, notwithstanding her condition, run any hazard for that satisfaction. So she was pregnant at the time, perhaps. It might have been a phantom pregnancy. It's not really certain. But she made an effort to see Mary before the latter's death. And this was denied by the Countess of Derby, who replied that the Queen could not be disturbed. Following Mary's death in late December 1694 from hemorrhagic smallpox, which is an almost always fatal strain of the disease, Anne was clearly grieving for her sister. Um, and that's made very clear from the letter she then sent to William. So she was definitely grieving for her sister.
After Mary's death, did tensions and like the relationship between William and Anne improve at all? Because obviously Anne is now heir apparent.
The situation was that it would have been mutually beneficial for them to both put aside their mutual dislike of each other, and they made an effort at some kind of public reconciliation. For example, St. James's Palace was given to Anne.
When did Anne become Queen of England, and was England happy that she became the Queen?
Anne became queen in March of 1702, following the death of William III. He died at Kensington Palace. If we go back to the Act of Settlement of 1701, which was created to ensure by law a Protestant succession, strengthened the Bill of Rights of 1689, which came about during the reign of William and Mary. Um, Both of these were amended in 2013, and that ended the system of male primogeniture. The act, known as the Succession to the Crown Act of 2013, came into effect, I believe, in 2015, and that also ended this law that disqualified people from the line of succession if they married Roman Catholics. And Anne's time ushered in a completely new period with new political groups, parties. You see more of the Tories and the Whigs and other figures. Um, so it was a whole new period. 1702 to 1714 was certainly a new period with all sorts of new topics and laws, and it was certainly something I hope people look into it a bit more because it is quite interesting.
So obviously you mentioned that Sarah Jennings was close to Anne. How did she rise up in Anne's court?
Well, she had pretty much grown up with her. Sarah was this strong and beautiful and outspoken young lady, and Anne looked up to her, and Sarah sort of took her under her wing and made her feel like she had a friend. And I think really Anne suffered from feeling a bit neglected and unloved, honestly. Um, as I said, she was in her sister's shadow for most of the time. And for her to eventually become queen, she was very loyal to the people who paid attention to her when she was considered nothing. Yeah.
Was Anne a active queen? Was she very active in affairs of state and politics?
I think mainly the politicians under her at this time were much more proactive with things. She had very poor health, and she was in, she was really an invalid in her later years. Um, and and yes, I believe she did give other people more power to be able to govern the country at that time.
How did the death of Anne's husband, George, affect Anne?
Well, this is something that I didn't really agree with the favorite, for example, the film. I don't think he was mentioned. Was he even mentioned? No. Okay, that's the thing. Major omission there because um, she was married to him for 25 years or so, and he died in 1708. And following his death, she was seen to have repeatedly kissed him um, as he was on his deathbed. She was kissing him. She was in floods of tears. Um, and her grief at losing George was profound. Yet Sarah maliciously implying that she was feigning these feelings, and she even cruelly remarked that Anne had eaten a great deal that day. So, I mean, again, we have so many examples of Sarah being absolutely horrible to Anne. Um, and it's just sad. I think it's terrible. But most people who saw Anne in the days following George's death, they were left in no doubt that she sincerely mourned him. He was her great love, and they did have a genuinely loving, long-term relationship. They had born and lost all their children together. This was a bond, a relationship that cannot be ignored when anyone talks about Queen Anne. Yes, lots of people like to say, like to repeat what Charles II said of him, that I've tried him drunk and I've tried him sober and there's nothing in him. Great. But okay, so he's not as fun loving and sociable as Charles II. Few people are. But I do think that George was devoted to Anne, and we should all respect that.
No, I completely agree. I think what goes on behind closed doors, you might see a completely different person to what you see
Mm.
in the public life.
Yeah.
How did Anne's health decline from 1713 onwards?
Well, her health had been poorly for decades, really, but it did get worse. She she had numerous ailments, and eventually that deteriorated into a coma. So I don't know what it could have been, but she died on the morning of the 1st of August, 1714, at the age of 49. So, and and it's important to remember, I think, that despite such a short life, a great deal happened, and even in her reign, we had some of the greatest military successes in British history. I mean, we had the formal union of Scotland and England. And despite her many tragedies in her personal life, she was seen by many as a mother figure for the nation. And there were many publications at the time that compared her favorably with Queen Elizabeth I. Um, and and she was also seen as being thoroughly English, unlike her Dutch brother-in-law. And he never had the kind of popularity she had, really. Um, and so there is that as well to consider.
I mean, I was going to ask you what legacy did Anne leave, but I think you've aptly
Oh,
described it there of how
well,
much her life left.
I, I think we could add to that perhaps. I mean, Queen Anne is often depicted as a sort of pathetic creature, which is very unkind. And she's often depicted as obese, shy, stubborn, suffering from chronically low self-esteem and plagued by one of the most tragic gynecological histories of the whole period. Um, but she was much more than this. She was a survivor. She survived the huge losses of her children, followed by the death of her love, her husband. She was alone except for her favorites, and even then, they weren't treating her as she ought to have been treated. And so when we look at the life of Queen Anne, I think it is important to remember that she had a strength of character that you can only have if you survive all that horrible stuff that life threw at her.
No, I mean, completely agree. I think she must have had an iron will to
Yeah,
survive what she survived.
yeah, I can't imagine how much she suffered.
Towards the end of my podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got a historical pet peeve?
I do. Um, this is going to irritate people, but it's the truth. Um, Talking in present tense about things that happened in the past. That really annoys me.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Hmm. I usually ask my guests this on Stuart Saturday Live, and yet this is the first time I think I've been asked, so thank you. Um, I think I would love to meet Afra Ben. Definitely. She lived from 1640 to 1689. She was a female spy. She was a dramatist and a royalist. I think she'd be really interesting to chat with, and there's so much I'd like to know about her life. I'm really interested in that. Yeah.
Have you got a favorite historical book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
This is very hard, but I'm gonna have to say I read A.S. Byatt's Possession when I was 16, and that has sort of dual timelines. You have the present day academics researching the past, and you have these fascinating characters in 19th century England. And you're sort of taken on a journey to uncover the truth about these people. So it's both a mystery, a look at academia, and a romance. And I found it really inspiring to continue my study of history at university.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, when would it be and why?
I wish I could have been in the crowds during the homecoming of Charles II in London in 1660. Apparently, it was an incredible spectacle and quite a joyous thing to be part of. Um, I remember being in the crowds at the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton, the now Prince and Princess of Wales, and it was extraordinary. There was a hugely uplifting vibe in amongst the crowds, and I have a suspicion that was only a fraction of what it was like at the Restoration.
Have you got a favorite historical fact?
Well, a lot of foods and drinks were introduced into Britain during the Stuart period, such as the banana in 1630s. Um, and some of these things were looked upon with a degree of suspicion. I remember Samuel Pepys, a famous diarist of the period. He tried orange juice, which was a very exciting, exotic new drink, and he was concerned that it might do him harm. So that some people thought orange juice was dangerous.
I mean, too much of it can make you feel a bit unwell, but it's
Yeah,
nice.
high sugar content, right? Yeah, so yeah, okay. But lovely.
Very nice, refreshing, nice little dose of vitamin C in the day.
Yeah, I like that.
Thank you so much for coming on today and dressing appropriately. My viewers can't see it, but you're currently dressed as a 17th century lady.
Thank you. I do what I can.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.